is certainly a more complex album maybe than Future Bites. I admit that since I was only able to listen to it yesterday, I'm still in the process of listening to it more times to digest it. For fans who will watch this interview before listening to this album, how would you define the Harmony Codex?
Well, I would try not to first, but if I have to, I think to me, I think of it as a piece of cinema for the ears. It has a very cinematic flow. It feels very much like you're going on a journey into the unknown, into surprising territories. And it has the parallel with cinema to me is it almost has like a feeling of scenes in a movie that are constructed to kind of make a logical narrative sense, but each scene has its own character. Each scene has its own kind of self-contained world. And that really is something that I think came from having been doing this for many years now and having the confidence, I think, to be able to put together all of these different kinds of music in one album, but trusting to the fact that they will all sound like me. And so they will have a kind of cohesion. They will kind of somehow all fit together. And I think about, I think going back to the very first piece of conceptual rock music I was ever aware of, which is when my dad used to listen to Dark Side of the Moon when I was a kid. And obviously it had a kind of big influence on me, subconsciously hearing this record. And what I love about that record, still love about that record, and I think Harmony Codex has this too, although I'm not comparing my album to that great masterpiece, but what I think it does have in common with an album like Dark Side of the Moon is that if you analyze Dark Side of the Moon, every track on the album is kind of almost in a different genre. So you have a piece of electronic music like On the Run, you have a piece of funk like Money, you have a piece of gospel music like The Great Gig in the Sky, and you have all of these different musical strands, and somehow they all just sound like Pink Floyd. They just sound like this one cohesive unit. So that idea of being able to put different kinds of music together in that very cinematic way, I think was implanted in me very early on by my dad listening to that record. I mean, I'm talking when I'm like 6 or 7 years old and I'm being brainwashed by hearing this record. So to me, it's having that kind of analogy with how cinema works, but adapting it to the process of making music.
Cool. Well, I was reading your interview to NME yesterday, and you said that this is a little bit like your lockdown album also. People might think differently because the Future Bites came out in 2021 after being pushed back. In fans' minds, the Future Bites is your lockdown album, but it was recorded before. The Harmony Codex is really your lockdown album, as I was reading in your interview. Since you said you recorded with a different mindset this time, to the point of putting a 10-minute ambient piece in the middle of the album this time, I'd like to know how much the lockdown influenced the final result for you.
It's a very good question. It's a hard one to answer because I'm not sure it's something I can really articulate. It's kind of an intangible thing. I think the sense of isolation from other musicians and from the rest of the world must have had a big influence, but it's difficult for me to characterize exactly what that is, except to say that the fact I wasn't able to go into a studio with a consistent group of musicians, as I might have done on previous records, I think that did mean that I thought about each song as a separate entity. One thing I was able to say to myself is, I have this one track. What would be the perfect band that I would want to play on this track? And to actually put together a lineup of musicians, not just for the album, but just for that one piece of music. So there are different drummers on different tracks. There are different bass players on different tracks. There are different guitar players. And so each track I kind of thought about as a separate entity, as a separate musical universe. And therefore I was able to put together a different musical lineup for each song. I don't think I would have done that if I had not been enforced into kind of this isolated situation where I was having to, you know, send out files essentially. But I think being in lockdown, being isolated from other musicians meant that I was kind of free to send out, you know what, let's try sending it out to this drummer, let's try sending it out to that drummer, and allowing myself to be surprised sometimes by what I might get back. So it was a little bit more experimental in that sense, experimenting with different lineups, experimenting in the sense that I didn't necessarily have any control over what the musicians were doing in their own studios, whether it was in New York or Stockholm or wherever they were. I had no control over them. I couldn't produce, you know, what they were doing. So for me, it was much more of an experimental, surprising process. And I got a lot of stuff back which didn't work for me, but I also got a lot of stuff back which I was really pleasantly, you know, wow, that's amazing. I never would have thought of that. And I think so I think lockdown in that sense forced me to go down a route that I probably wouldn't have gone down.
Amazing. And I don't know exactly what the timeline of this album is in relation to the Closure continuation by Porcupine Tree. I know Closure was largely made a decade earlier, but I'm sure many fans will also think that the Harmony Codex might be a reflection of the Porcupine Trees reunion, as the path taken here is a little different from the future bites. Was there any influence from Porcupine Trees come back on your new album?
I don't think so. I mean, if there was an influence, maybe just in the back of my mind, I think that I felt like the fans, and I understand that I have a, you know, one thing I understand about my fan base is there are these little kind of tribes within the fan base. There are the fans that like the more reflective, nostalgic, ambient stuff. There are the fans that like the more pop stuff. There are the fans that like the more classic progressive rock. There are the fans that like the progressive metal stuff. And I think I felt like I'd let the latter sort of category down a bit over the last few records, the progressive metal stuff. I'm not really interested in metal very much these days. I feel like it's something I did 10, 15 years ago, and I don't want to do it anymore. So I think part of me felt like, oh, okay, doing a new Porcupine Tree record is kind of giving those fans something perhaps they can enjoy, they can relate to more of the big metal riffs, the big guitars. And maybe that liberated me when I was doing the Harmony Codex to not have to worry about, oh, you know, I haven't got enough guitars on this record, you know. And maybe a piece like the Harmony Codex, which is, as we've discussed, is 10 minutes of essentially just ambient sound. There's no guitars on that track at all. Maybe the fact that I knew I was being the guitar player in the Porcupine Tree record liberated me to feel like, okay, you know what, I can just put the guitar aside and not have to worry about the fans that are expecting guitar stuff. Do you know what I mean? So I think maybe if there is an influence, that might have been the influence that it had on the record in kind of liberating me from feeling like I had to do more guitar stuff, basically.
All right. And I wish I had time to talk about every track on this album, but since we don't, I'm going to ask you one of those tough questions. Out of all the tracks on this album, which one surprised you the most when you heard the final result, especially considering that you were not able to produce every musician on the record?
So there's a track on the album called Impossible Tightrope, which is actually the longest track on the record. It's about 11 minutes long, and it's predominantly instrumental. And that was a track that was very experimental in the sense that I went out, I must have gone out to something like 30 different musicians, asking them essentially to respond to and react to a fairly basic idea, a pretty simple kind of, you know, germ of an idea. And a lot of the contributions I got back for that track were things that were very surprising to me. For example, I used a drummer called Nate Wood, an American drummer, and one thing I felt like I wanted on that track is I wanted almost like a jazz sensibility in the drumming, but I didn't want it to sound like old-fashioned jazz. I wanted it to sound like a jazz, kind of like a jazz drummer that had grown up listening to drum and bass, or Aphex Twin or Square Pusher or something like that. And I asked around, and I was recommended this guy called Nate Wood, who I'd not come across before. And I sent the track to him, and he did something amazing, which kind of resonated with what I wanted in a way. He took an approach which I don't think I've ever had a drummer quite like that on a record before. He is a jazz drummer, but he has that electronic sensibility as well. And I think that was true. That track generally, the contributions I was getting back, I was getting so much stuff back, and so much of it was really interesting, but I almost had to find the ingredients or the elements that would go together in the most logical and cohesive way. And they weren't always what you might call, you know, the best elements, the most impressive elements, but they were the ones that seemed to make sense to me, kind of what I wanted to achieve. For example, the bass on that track is me. Now, I had a couple of other bass players have a go at it who were much better, and they did much more impressive stuff than me, but somehow it wasn't what I wanted. It wasn't what I heard in my head, and I ended up always coming back to my kind of demo bass. So I think things like that are surprising, that it's not always the most impressive or the most technically, you know, showy performances that are the ones that feel right. You're looking to create music. You're not looking to create something that has kind of a kind of competitive, impressive element to it. And that's always constantly something I find myself, you know, kind of arguing with myself over. So that was a very important and kind of surprising process, putting that track together.
Cool. And this album is going to be released with a second CD offering reimagining of the tracks, and you've got some good company for that. Roland Orzabal, Manic Street Preachers, Mikael Ackerfeld from Opeth, Interpol. What was it like working with which one of them?
Well, it was amazing. I mean, Roland particularly is one of my songwriting heroes, one of my biggest influences. And I think when I was thinking about getting some different versions of some of the tracks done, some of which I did myself, you know, but I wanted to involve some other musicians, and I wanted to involve musicians that I admired, and I wanted people that had really not done a lot of that kind of thing before. So I could have easily gone to, I don't know, you know, some big remix guy or somebody that makes their living from doing mixes or has done a lot of remixes or reinterpretations. But I thought, no, who do I know that's probably maybe they've never even been asked before to do a remix. I don't think Roland had ever been asked to do a remix before. But I thought, well, that's great, because he's going to approach it in a completely different way to someone who's kind of got a method, who's got a kind of established pattern of work that they bring to the idea of doing a remix or reimagining a track. And I thought, well, someone like Roland will come at a song from the point of view of a songwriter's mentality, not a programmer's mentality or a remixer's mentality. So that was wonderful. And, you know, I mean, we talked about what was surprising to me. I mean, that was also surprising. I didn't know what I was going to get back from someone like Roland or someone like the Manics. I mean, the Manics, basically, they just took my vocal and they created a completely different piece of music to go with my vocal. So the economies of scale, the track is kind of electronic. So they created a guitar, bass, drum piece of music to go with the lead vocal, which took it in a completely different direction. So that was, you know, fascinating and surprising and really very thrilling for me, you know, as you can imagine, to be able to work with these guys and to hear what they do to my music.
Amazing. Now talking a little bit about Brazil, you came down here 4 times, first time in 2012, more than a decade ago, and last time in 2018. What memories do you have from Brazil and Brazilian audience?
Well, I'm sure you hear this a lot. extremely passionate and very, very noisy and exciting. It's thrilling to play to the Brazilian audience. Last time I was there, I was so ill. I barely managed to get on stage. I think I had the tummy trouble, you know. So my memory of the last show is not necessarily the best because I was feeling so sick on stage. But you know, I've had wonderful experiences down there. Never the biggest audiences. I mean, compared to some other South American places like Chile and Argentina, I think Brazil, the audience has always been smaller for me and for Porcupine Tree down there. But you know what? Maybe that's changing. Maybe that's beginning to change now. I think I remember the very first time I came as a solo artist, I was disappointed. I think only about 200 or 300 people came to see me, and I'd come all this way, you know, with my band, and that was disappointing. But you know, maybe things have changed. I'd love to come down again.
This is definitely changing, I can assure to you.
Oh, good. Oh, well, that's good to hear. That's good. Right.
And for my last question, just out of curiosity, and maybe a bit of a bold question, in addition to your work as a musician, you have developed a long career remixing classic records by Tears for Fears, Jethro Tull, King Crimson, many others. Is there any classic record that you would like to remix, maybe thinking about something that you could do better or differently comparing to the original mix?
Well, there's lots of different, you kind of touched on a few different things there. So there are certain albums that I would love to remix because I think sonically they could have been better. And there are other albums that I would love to do a mix into spatial audio because I think they're amazingly recorded albums. And so in the latter category, I would love to do, for example, any of Talk Talk's records, Color of Spring, Spirit of Eden. Any of Kate Bush's records would be amazing. Any of Peter Gabriel's records would be amazing. I mean, honestly, the list is so long. We'd be here all day. We'd be here all day talking about it. But there are some, you know, Kate Bush, Peter Gabriel, Talk Talk. A lot of records, you know, that I kind of grew up listening to, particularly in the 80s. I was a teenager in the 80s. So a lot of my favorite records come from the 80s. So there you go. Color of Spring, Hounds of Love, Peter Gabriel's fourth record. And they're also incredibly innovative and experimental pop records. In other words, they work within the kind of medium of pop, but they're also very creative and they sound beautiful. So there's a few, but really the list is very, very long. There's a lot of great records out there. There's been a lot of great records over the years.